Now let me share the screen. Okay. Okay, so today we're finishing up Plotinus is on our allotted spirit, chapter 6, and yeah, I think that should take up our hour and a half. We'll see. So yes, it seems to be in general a chapter about Daimonism and eschatology. He seems to change the subject a few times. We'll see if there's more unity to it than that. Um, okay. So he starts, one moment. Ah, okay. Yes. Right. So he starts here discussing the sage. So you can just read this first passage, either on the screen or in your book. Sure.
Okay. Is it the same one? What then is the
Yeah.
achieved sage? The How did we start with, how did we get to this question? Was there
So
I didn't
there's
have
no yeah, it's I mean he was just talking about transmigration, if I remember correctly. About the world as perfect and transmigration. So it didn't um and he had just discussed this thing about how when when Timaeus says that we pick the Republic says that we pick
right.
the thing, it means during life and stuff like that. So uh,
So
yeah, it's a bit out of the blue that he asked, like, okay, who is the sage? Yeah.
which is like the ideal person, the
Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
like the virtuous person. The word that's being translated here uh in as the sage in Greek is spoudios. So, I mean, it just means someone who has virtue, right? So, like, it's a term that Aristotle will often use for the like
Mhm.
uh, mature person who's grown in virtue and things.
Okay. Um well, okay, the answer is one whose act is determined by the higher phase of the soul. Okay. The question is, what is the higher or highest phase, right? It does not suffice to perfect virtue to have only the spirit equivalent in all men as cooperator in the life. The active force in the sage is the intellective principle. I don't know which spirit he's talking about. Is that the Plato's spirit from the Republic? Um, the diviner
So,
phase. Yeah.
yeah, finish the paragraph and all.
Okay, the diviner phase of demon soul, which is therefore in itself, which therefore is itself its his presiding spirit, or is guided by his presiding spirit of its own, no other than the very divinity. Okay.
Okay, so here he has right, he's picking up a few ideas. So yeah, this is the Socrates spirit or the Platonic idea that there's a spirit that guides you, and he has this idea that the spirit will always be in some sense one level above you. So if you live like most people a rational life, then reason is going to be the the dominant phase, the thing that's dominant in you and each act, and then the thing higher than reason, nous, is going to be your spirit. And of course, if you live a life that's totally dominated by the senses, then actually what's dominant in you is your sensible life, and your spirit is actually rational. Now, this equivalent in all men is not there in the Greek. So it's just as it does not suffice to perfect virtue to have only this spirit as cooperator in life, as co-operator in the life. The acting force in the stage is the intellective principle. So since normally human beings are rational animals and reason therefore is the active thing, then like the normal thing is to say that the that our daimon is our nous, right? It's and we saw also that uh, in the life of Plotinus by Porphyry, he seems to identify the higher self, this uh, part of the soul that's nous, that's always contemplating, with the daimon, and that's basically what um, Plotinus is saying here, that it's actually not enough for the accomplished person to have the nous simply as um, this moral power that accompanies us and that is actually like our ideal that we never live up to, but rather nous should actually be what acts in us. We should identify ourselves with that daimon, which means that the spirit of the sage won't be nous, it'll be something higher than that. It will be very divinity, so something like the one or something. Right.
Right. And that's not exactly what it says in the how did you call it? Okay, I see the problem.
In
That's not
the
like the regular like for example the Republic ideal of like the complete soul and complete city is something like the rational part is guiding it and controlling the um anger, thumos and desire and stuff like that. And he's taking like these this goes back to like saying you have to escape the world and all these kind of things where it's not enough and you have to
exactly.
have the something higher than that.
Yes. Yeah. So this ties in with the theory of virtues that actually, yeah, like the moral ideal of the Republic isn't the highest moral ideal. There's like a higher one which is suggested, for instance, in the Theaetetus or in the Phaedo, where you purify yourself, you separate yourself from your desires. And so like it's not just that you control and you only have like a moderate amount of food, but actually you don't want food and you just eat in order so that your body doesn't die. And furthermore, there's something even more than the negative part of purifying yourself. There's also this turning towards nous, which is actually an identifying with nous. And here there's this idea of identifying with nous, which here it becomes identifying with what normally is your daimon, and also the um and also, but then here there's like this new thing, which is then you have this even higher daimon, this god, which is a daimon for you.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, okay. That's so that's something we already know, sort of.
Right.
Um,
I guess this question, who then is the sage? It repeats, in a sense, the question that came at the beginning of chapter three, because chapter three has a parallels question, which is who will then become a spirit, a daimon, the one who is down here, and who will become a god, the one who is down here. And so here, actually, it seems like who is the sage? It's the one who's going to become a daimon. Right?
mhm. Okay. Uh, okay, but this exalts the sage above the intellectual principle as possessing for presiding spirit the prior to the intellectual principle, right? Because of this idea of like presiding spirit being above you, so therefore he is above the intellectual principle. How then does it come about that he was not from the very beginning all that he now is?
Right. So here he thinks, wait, if you are identified, I think there are two things here. Firstly, yeah, he says that. this exalts the sage above the intellectual principle. So he has something higher, like it has like a good itself or a god of some kind in as his daimon, but also he himself is actually kind of like a noose. And then he says that there's a problem now about why wasn't he always like this? Like if you come to identify yourself with that thing which is immutable, why weren't you always like this if it's immutable? So I think the question arises more because he's identified himself with the intellectual principle. Like, how can you become immutable? If you're immutable, you should have always been immutable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how can someone become a sage? They should have been like that since the beginning. So this is a question. I think that in part he already has something like an answer to this because the answer is something like, well, actually, the noose was always active. He always had this daimon with him, even from birth, guiding him. He just realized, in some sense, he just realized that this was who he really was at some point. Um, but he gives a different answer, and or rather, he spells out this answer a bit more in what follows.
Okay, the failure is due to the disturbance caused by birth. So it was being born that was the problem. Though before all reasoning, there exists the instinctive movement reaching out towards its own. So,
Right. Yeah. So let's stop here. So this thing about the failure is due to disturbance caused by birth. Disturbance caused by birth is a phrase from the Timaeus. And we can ask here, like specifically, and it's about how, like, there's this description of the Timaeus about when the soul is born, is put into a body, then it starts to get like it had these orbits, these circles that were like the circle of the same and the other of the world soul. But then when it's in the body, it starts to be moved in all kinds of ways, right? The living thing as a whole did indeed move, but it would proceed in a disorderly, random, and irrational way that involved all six of the motions. It would go forwards and backwards, right, left, etc. And then also, he mentioned specifically the elements here, about how it encounters the elements from without. Such disturbances would occur when the body encountered and collided with external fire, or for that matter, with a hard lump of earth, or with the flow of gliding waters, or when it was caught up by a surge of air-driven winds. And question here, like, what is this? Okay, like Plato has this idea that the soul gets all confused and the circles of its soul get bent out of shape when you're born, when you're put into a body. But what does that actually have to do with this question about, like, okay, this is a person whose, let's say, his vocation or who he really is nous. Why does that then, why does talking about this being in touch with the elements or explain anything, right? Um, I think the idea might actually go back to Empedocles. Because Empedocles, remember, he is someone who, in one book, he describes himself as this passed out daimon, right? He was a daimon, but then he was condemned to be thrown around by the elements, right? Um, the might of the ether drives it to the sea spits it out to the threshold of land, the earth sends it into the rays of the gleaming sun, and the sun hurls it into the whirling of the ether. One receives it from another, and all hate it. And here he's talking about transmigration, but it's like transmigration being expelled by the elements. And also, but he ends becoming a god, right? You see me going about as divine God, no longer mortal, honored amongst all, it seems, and wreathed in ribbons and verdant garlands. So I think this background of Empedocles has made Plotinus think that, um, this passage from the Timaeus is talking about something is, talking really about this question about how does, this divine spirit agency actually become, not, why is it not perfect from the beginning? In some sense, so maybe, if that's the case, then that means that the what Plotinus is getting from here, the disturbances that the body encounters, it's not just say that, the world is very loud for babies, and so babies, are very bothered by, all the sights and sounds and touches they find. It's something about how, it's since it's about transmigration, I think like the elements here and the disturbance is also something about like desires that are introduced by our being in the in the elemental world. Um and so it's something about that the disturbance caused by birth, the contact with the elements, which is not just as it were a bodily contact from without, but some kind of
Mhm.
something that affects us within, that in some sense confuses the soul. It makes it think that that it's not, it gains these desires besides the purely spiritual ones, besides these insights and desire for contemplation that belongs to nous. Um, However, he says the failure is due to the disturbance caused by birth, though before all reasoning, there exists the instinctive movement reaching out towards its own. So, okay, when we're born, we get all these desires tied to bodies, and of course, we have to somehow overcome them and separate ourselves from them. But there's always, and maybe this is the answer, right? There's always this basic desire for the good, right? It's Plato's theory. It's like it appears in the Republic and other texts. He thinks that everyone has this desire for the good itself, for the good as such, and therefore, in some sense, from the very beginning, there's 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 some like desire acting that represents his true self.
Mhm.
Um, and right, and then uh, okay, yeah. Now the next thing I have to explain is something about the Greek in the next line. Are you
Okay.
with me?
Yeah. So if I follow you hear me, right? If I follow
Yeah.
it's the logic goes here something like he got to the idea um basically via the way of saying that the accomplished sage or the perfect person is not some. So the idea was the perfect person is not a perfect person. In the sense of a person as the thing that we notice being born and in the hospital where the babies are born. It's the perfect person is really a perfect almost God or one thing below the God. I'm not something like that. And since we say that, right, if you would say the perfect person is just something like Aristotle would say, someone that has a good life or something like that, then we don't really have this problem because that makes sense. It should be something that uh, you're not born with, or maybe you are potentially, whatever, but it's something within the power. Like it starts from you being a accomplished person and virtuous and so on. But if he has a perfect person as being something beyond humanity almost, or entirely beyond humanity, what we call humanity, then why then there's like this problem of why isn't he like how did it why is there a need for work, something like that? Why is there a need for becoming a why is there ethics? Like perfect people are not people, and that's something like the soul or the not even the soul, the intellect, which for him is the same thing, I guess. But which is beyond everything, and then it should just be that, and that's all. And then the answer is no, he is, there is a problem with being born. So it's not that being born is like a blank slate where you start with everything and then you have to build up from there. It's you start full, and being born starts is like taking away. It's a problem being born because it adds something to what you are more than like being. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes sense. So yeah, like he's like the perfect person is actually like they're like this manifestation of like cosmic reason, like the laws of the universe. So they should be identical. It should always be the same thing. And then the question is like why aren't they always like this? And the answer is well, because birth adds this problem they need to get over. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, you
Yeah.
could even ask like something like, so does he? I mean, I don't here he doesn't ask. You could even ask how there could be more than one person, or something like that, or how this cosmic thing is embodied at all.
Uh, can you repeat the one more than one person?
I mean, the question of it being always identical with itself and this and the same thing, there, he's starting the question in like the ethical sense, like how why would he have to become a good person? And there should be also like a metaphysical question, right? Which is how it's possible for the divine principle or intellect connect with the divine principle to become the life of a body, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's like a question that he has in other treatises. It's like, but and that's like precisely the question about like then what really distinguishes soul from intellect in his system. That's what this question.
Hmm.
Okay, and so he says,
Okay,
yeah,
so now
for
then we go back, right? Okay, so I'm just like following. So since being born is something that adds problems, um, it doesn't. So then there's, on the other hand, there's still this reaching, right? This like reversion or something like desire towards the good, which is not touched or which is more basic than the kind of things that humans are good or bad at, or something like that. Is that something like that?
it's more basic than any specific desires that we have that we have, and especially it's more basic than these passing desires that you get by being born. It,
Okay,
it's
so being born is very sad, but not so sad as to take away this.
exactly. Um, and it's like a part of the answers then. Oh, like of the answers, like then why wasn't the wise person always like this is like, well, there was always this this spark in him. There was always this spark in him from the beginning. It just had to consume all the darkness, but the spark was there from the beginning. Um,
Right. Okay.
and th
Um,
and then and then he says, well,
'Cause
da,
otherwise
da, da,
you would so because if I like could understand if because if there wouldn't be like this spark or this like more basic desire, then it wouldn't be explainable how he could become back into a god.
exactly.
Because you might be able to become into like a good political person, but you probably can't become something different.
Yes. Yeah. That's the idea.
Hmm.
Now, then the McKenna then translates an instinct which the sage finally rectifies in every respect.
Hmm.
So the Greek just says, then does it correct entirely? And it's not clear what it is. The best solution that I found amongst like the Gerson, they say it is the daimon, and I don't think that's right at all. It is probably the instinctive movement. It's this motion, so this basic desire. And so he's asking, and does this desire, does this desire, always, is it always victorious? Does it always correct the whole soul? Right? And then the answer, so in McKenna, it goes, not in every respect. The soul is so constituted that its life history and its general tendency will answer not merely to its own nature, but also to the conditions amongst which it acts. This is a bit far away from the Greek, but I think he's got the meaning right. The meaning is because like the Greek uh, is very dense. It's like not entirely, especially if the soul has such a disposition that in things like this, it is like that, having such a life and such a choice. So, but I think he's picked it up right. So the point is this basic desire doesn't always win out. Why? Because the soul picks through its choices, picks its own life. That is, there are other elements to the soul's development than just this basic motion towards the good, right?
Hmm.
So the sage can be the person, the sage who becomes a sage is a person where this basic desire wins out. But some people have the basic desire and don't become sages, right? They could have become sages, but they ended up becoming animals.
Right. So this is the sort of the same answer as the question as the answer to the question, why he isn't always, because he's born,
Right.
and then that's also why he's not. Although, and this is just like to answer the same question on the question of, since there is this basic instinct, which is what causes him to be able to return, why doesn't he always or entirely win? Well, for the same reason, because he was born.
Right. Yeah. So he's saying, yes, there has to be a desire, something there from the beginning, but although there's something there from the beginning, it doesn't mean that, everyone who is a sage was born to be a sage, and everyone who's born to be a sage will be a sage. Right. Yeah, and you remember like this thing from birth is actually a theme that shows up both in the Apology. So Socrates mentions that, yeah, my daimon talked to me ever since I was a kid. And also in the life of Plotinus, Porphyry says, yes, he was marked out from birth. So this idea that there's something different about these people from the beginning is present also in the as it were the anecdotal forms.
So, so is that also that there are certain specific people who are like this, but not everyone is like this,
Yeah, so I think the
or that's because of their choices in the previous life and everything?
yeah, I mean, because right, no choice starts from nothing, right? There's always a previous life. And I think, because of the Phaedrus, every soul eventually spends time up there contemplating. It means that every soul, occasionally has this kind of life where they become a sage and go on. But, most souls aren't part of their cycle at that moment. Um, so yeah, so that's the beginning, and then and then he continues talking about the daimon of the sage, right?
Okay. Now, the presiding spirit, as we read, conducting a soul to the underworld, right? That's the ceases to be its guardian, except when the soul resumes, in its later choice, the former state of life. But meanwhile, what happens to it? From the passage in the Phaedo, which tells how it presents the soul to judgment, we gather that after its death, it resumes the form it had before the birth, but that then, beginning again, it is present to the souls in their punishment during the period of their renewed life, a time not so much of living as of expiation.
Right. This is a very it's a dense passage. It seems like this is an example where it seems like he's decided to talk about something different. Now he's talking about like what happens to the daimon um, between lives or something like that, or like since the daimon is like if you live a different life, then you're going to have a new daimon when you in your next life, and so what happens to your old daimon? I think he might still be talking about the daimon of the sage, right? So he's still talking about the same issue because remember here he says, like the sage, he um like the question is he's someone who identifies with his daimon. So he identifies with something like immutable. How does this happen? Um, like why isn't he always like this? Well, he's born, he has all these problems, he has to overcome them. But there is a sense here in which then, so from the beginning, he had to have that daimon, and then he like returns to it. And so he's asking here, like, how does that how can you actually return to have the same daimon that you had before? And then he says it's only when you pick the same life. So where is he getting this from? So the first of all, the idea that you would change daimons is first from the Phaedo. Right. So the Phaedo has says this explicitly. It distinguishes between the diamond that takes you down and the diamond that takes that leads you out. Right. We are told that when each person dies, the guardian spirit was allotted to him in life proceeds to lead him to a certain place. Whence those who have been gathered together there must, after being judged, proceed to the underworld with the guide who has been appointed to lead them thither from here, right? So again, following the Republic, um, um, Plotinus thinks that this daimon that was allotted to you in life is actually one that you chose, right? It's actually the next higher principle after your after whatever leading principle you chose in this life. So if you say let's say you lived an average human life, you were like a rational person who sought moderation and justice as discussed in the Republic, then it's a noose of some kind. Okay. And so that's what will take you down to Hades. And then he says, having there undergone what they must and stayed there the appointed time, they are led back here by another guide after long periods of time. The journey is not as Aeschylus as Telephus describes it. He says that only one single path leads to Hades, but I think it is neither one nor simple, for then there would be no need of guides, and one could not have any mistake if there were but one path. As it is likely to have many forks and crossroads, and I base this judgment on the sacred rites and customs here. So Plotinus joins this with the Republic, where um, the life that like the next diamond, the diamond that leads you out of Hades, is the diamond that you choose there. That's based on the life you lived here. So there's a question here about the guardian spirit that was allotted to you and the guardian spirit that you will then pick in your next life. It could be that there's like a separation, like the guardian spirit that you had during this life was the one based on the choices of your last life, and the guardian spirit of your next life is based on the choices of this life, right? So yeah, so if last life you lived a rational life, so in this life your guardian spirit is Nous. And in your next life, let's say if you became a sage and you became identified yourself with this guardian spirit, then in your next life your guardian spirit is going to be a god. But if in this life you actually went down a notch and you became, a total hedonist given over to your pleasures, then you're going to get a different guardian spirit in the next life, which is um, the guardian spirit of that's that's going to be just a rational spirit.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
so so that's right. And so that means that if you were going to get the same rational, the same spirit as before, it's because you made the same choices again, or analogous choices, right? And that might be actually, in some sense, the ideal for the sage, since he has the for presiding spirit the god already, and so he wants to stick with the god in some sense, right? And so he has to some sense repeat the choices he made in the past life. There's this is something we'll read these texts again later, but there's something similar to this in Proclus or parallel to it, where he says something like each person has two daimones. There's the daimon that connects him to his god, to his planetary god, and there's the daimon of the choice that corresponds to the life he chose here. And then again, the in that case, the sage, he uses a different word, but anyway, the best lives is when you pick again, is when you pick the same daimon to guide your life here and that connects you to your God. And so again, it's like there's also this structure of repeating. So of repeating your choice. I think this passage in Plotinus might actually be where Proclus is getting this idea. Um, but But in any case, that in Proclus, there's additional cosmology there. He's talking about like this period, because there the prior life isn't like a prior life you lived here. It's a prior life up in the heavens where you were with your God and you were with a daimon that connected you with your God. Like if you're a soul of Mars, you are with a daimon of Mars. And then in your choice of life down here, you chose again that same daimon. Um, and so that might be like, I think that's later how Proclus will interpret this passage. Here it seems more like something like the sage, he does again what he did in the last life. And that kind of like the background might be things like like why it's important for you to find out about your past lives, right? In part, it's to understand where you're coming from, but it might like there might be some also like some moral function here about like, well, if you are a good person, then you want to, in some sense, repeat what you did in your last life,
Or at least not
um,
make it worse.
or at
Like,
least not make it worse. Yeah,
mm,
yeah, because yeah, I mean, you don't want to, because and like yeah, like you might up against similar difficulties, and you have to make the right choice this time, and not make like the choice you made last time. There isn't anything like in Plotinus's life, uh, Porphyry's life of Plotinus that explains or that talks about, Plotinus investigating his past lives. But there are like reports that this was important to Pythagoreans and so on. So like it might be. Um, but that's just the first paragraph here,
yeah, that's the
right?
like side note. That seems like there would be like a feedback loop, right? Because if you choose the good kind of diamond in this life, then in the next life that would be your like default or something like that. And then it would make you make those like you would be like Socrates who has a diamond that tells him not to do bad things. And
Yeah,
then you may be only after that could you like really be like Socrates who lives forever or something like that.
yeah.
You
There
could,
is a
but
kind of
Socrates wasn't forced to follow his daimon. That's the important thing, because so he still had a choice, and therefore could have became worse. But
exactly. So there's this I just say there's this tendency of a good feedback loop, so that if you lead a good life, your next life you will have you will already be in a better position. But since there's always freedom, so you like the conditions are always better, but it doesn't oblige anyone, right? A soul, looking in the centuries view, might be on an upward trajectory, but then it makes a decision at some point and goes down again. This kind of thing.
okay, but now is
Um, now there's a really puzzling thing where it says from the passage which tells how it presents the soul to judgment, we gather that after that it resumes the form it had before birth, but that then beginning again it is present to the souls in their punishment in the period before their renewed life, the time not so much of living as of their expiation. So again, I mean, McKenna, he expands on the Greek and um and then and especially, it's I don't know. So one interpretation is I have to admit that I'm not really sure how to interpret it. One way is just say, yeah, say if you choose a different daimon, what happens to your other daimon? Well, it takes up the job of punishing souls. Because in the Republic, we hear about how daimons also have this function of punishing bad souls. That's the issue here. I mean, and McKenna adds the reference to the Phaedo, like Plotinus doesn't mention the Phaedo by name here. Um, and the problem about adding a reference to the Phaedo is that actually in the Phaedo there is no punishment of souls by Diogenes. There is in the Republic, but in the Phaedo the uh, souls are punished just by the mechanisms of the underworld rivers that spew you out and take you back in and things like that. Um, so so yeah, that's an issue. Way of interpreting it, which might be forcing the Greek, is something like to think that the period of their renewed life um, it's not that it's the period before their renewed life, but rather that he's calling this life punishment. And um, and so he's saying, let me give you like a translation. And before this, how is it? Right? Um, or instead of this, how is it? Um, the um, uh, right, the conducting of the soul to judgment um, to the say it is yeah it is going to the same form after death which it had before birth. Um, just as starting from a new beginning, in the intervening time of birth, it is present to those being punished. Um, whether, um, and this is not life for them, but justice. Um, and so, yeah, another way I think of it is something like that he says that, okay, if we what happens to the daimon if we don't pick the same life? And that would be like if he's thinking if it's not if this if he's thinking about the case of the sage, if the sage doesn't pick the same life and he can only go down, so if he picks a worse life, then he's going to have a daimon, but the that he's going to have like a daimon that's going to punish him because this new worse life is just punishment. I don't know. It's just a puzzling passage, and different translators do different things.
Hmm. But it seems
Um,
like the question is something like what happens with the diamonds in their free time or something like that? Like if they're not leading the soul?
yeah, that seems. I mean, that's one way of doing it. Um, yeah,
Or
that's
maybe
one
he's
way.
saying something he's if if we think he's trying to do something ethical, then maybe he's trying to like think of how bad is the bad choice or something like is the better say someone picked a worse life or like was born this time. with a worse, if I'd like translate it to something like that I know of me sort of with like worse starting conditions, like your diamond chooses the city in which you're born, which is not a very virtuous one because in the previous life that's the kind of things you liked. Now the question would, it's backwards, but then the question would be, okay, so then are you totally lost? And he's trying to say that it's somehow present to the souls, even if this life is a punishment, like you were born in the Soviet Union or whatever. um, you still have some access to, like your diamond is punishing you, so he's still there or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I'm gonna have to sit with the Greek. I also will have to sit with the Greek eventually because I want to translate this text into Portuguese later. But I think maybe if we think that the um, subject isn't the daimon, but it is something like the sage, it makes more sense. He's asking not, but meanwhile, what happens to it, but rather something like, but what happens instead of this? So, what happens if the sage doesn't make the same choices and doesn't become good? Then, indeed, he, as it were, goes back to um, he goes he goes back to like he steps down from to his prior life and that's punishment for him. But I'd have to see if it will work. But I think it might be something like that. And yeah, so I don't think that it's like because yeah, like the how McKenna is translating it and other people, it's like, what are diamonds doing in their spare time? I don't really see how this question is connected with with the discussion. It's like, oh, and by the way, what do diamonds do in their spare time? Okay.
Right, and this would make sense because otherwise people would always be getting stuck. I mean, if you think of like something like the bad conditions which you're in are a punishment. Now, punishment already is some kind of meaning, or it has some kind of direction in it, where it's that like it says here expiation. I don't know what the word really is, but something
Yeah,
like
like yeah,
like Plato always being against punishing bad people. You only have to make them better or something like punishment has some kind of teaching in it already, where it's like, okay, he's punishing you, but that doesn't mean that he's not in the same time guiding you back to something better.
yeah. The Greek here is just dike, so like justice or maybe even a sentence. So yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Let's carry on then. So next there's just this short passage about what happens if you choose a worse life.
Okay, but the souls that enter into brute bodies, are they controlled by something less than the presiding spirit? Less than this presiding spirit? I don't know which is this. No, there's still a spirit, but an evil or a foolish one.
Right. The this isn't in the Greek. That's just McKenna. Is it something less than a spirit? No, there. So here he's saying no. There's also these evil, like so. You always have a daimon, even if you become an animal. But then the daimon, he says, is an evil or foolish one. And here, like the philosophers, typically like Plato, Aristotle, and others, will always argue, no, if it's something higher than us, it has to be good because the more higher you are in the ontological hierarchy, the better you are, and things like that. Immortal things can't be bad, and they have like that. But of course, there was in Greek tradition and in Roman this idea that there are also evil daimonists. So there are evil spirits that are like and for philosophers, they're like spirits that attract you to matter and so on. In and So that's what Plotinus is talking about. So like the daimonists were the souls that are giving life to animals are these evil daimonists that pull people down to matter. And in Porphyry's on abstinence, he talks about how these are the daimonists that are fed by meat sacrifice, right? So that's how, but that's like some later color from Porphyry. But yeah, so that's the idea. He wants to make sure that insists that you always have a diamond here. Um, and then he changes, and then he asks, but what about the souls that attain to the highest? Okay, so you can
Mhm.
read that.
Of these higher souls, some live in the world of sense, so higher meaning back to the better ones.
Mm-hmm.
Some in the world of sense, some above it. So not all of them are alive in this world. And those in the world of sense, or means next stage, and those in the world of sense inhabit the sun or another planetary of the planetary bodies. The other occupy the fixed sphere above the planetary, holding the place which they have merited through living here the superior life of reason.
Right.
Uh, okay. So there's like,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, so this above it means is literally outside it. So some live in the world and some are outside it. So presumably in the intelligible, they go outside like in the Phaedrus. But in the Phaedrus, I mean, there they actually go really outside. I mean, in the Phaedrus they just stick their heads out, but here it seems like you can really step outside entirely. And the um they it's McKenna's translation here to say um right, and then right, and here those in the world of sense. So, and in the world of sense, he says they inhabit the sun or another planetary body. This might be just, I mean, you could, since the sun and the planets and the stars are always alive, it's probably not that they become the soul of the sun or the planets, but rather that they are somehow, like later in Proclus's view, they're living around it, they're, as it were, inhabiting it, like aliens. But no, don't take that too literally. Sure. The And there might also be some kind of gradation here where like the better you are, the higher the sphere. So the best souls, but which are still not so good as to leave this world, they're in the fixed stars. And then the ones slightly below that are in Saturn, and the others are with Jupiter, and so on. Right. So the structure of of the cosmos gives us, as it were, many graded lives for wise lives, right? And so you can be there are actually many different grades of wisdom here now, all of a sudden. This idea that you can actually leave the world is mentioned in the Phaedo, in the final myth, right? Those who are deemed to have lived in an extremely pious life are freed and released from the regions of the earth as from a prison. They make their way up to a pure dwelling place and live on the surface of the earth. Those who have purified themselves sufficiently by philosophy live in the future altogether without a body. They make their way to even more beautiful dwelling places, which is hard to describe clearly, nor do we now have the time to do so. So, right, so here, instead of talking about the heavens, he talks about uh, the surface of the earth. But remember, like the Phaedo view is that the earth that we know is just the fake earth. We live inside these big hollows, spaces of the true earth. And so, one way of taking um, this myth is to say, well, the true Earth is actually the whole cosmos, and when you're on the surface of the Earth, you're in the heavens. But but anyway, there's this idea that you could even release yourself from a body, and that's this idea of going outside the world of sense. It's an idea that you won't actually get in later Platonists or later Platonists, like Proclus will backtrack from this because he thinks the best case scenario, you are back in the heavens, right? And sure, you're not in the world of sense in the sense that you're not paying attention to it, you're just paying attention to the forms. But and your body just moves without you paying attention to it. Like Plotinus thinks that, the whole world is alive without the world soul needing to pay attention to it at all. But here in Plotinus, there does seem to be this possibility of entirely exiting. Um, so we have tons of options here for the wise. Um, and This, going back to the stars, also has as background the Timaeus, right? Because in the Timaeus, there's this idea that he actually originally sowed the souls amongst all the stars, right? So he first creates the rational souls. He distributes them amongst the stars, and then he gives them these vehicles, which later becomes these astral bodies that they have, and then he explains to them their whole like all the laws of fate, and then the lower gods, the junior gods, then put them in mortal bodies. But anyway, that's this idea that they how in some sense they belong to the spheres. It's interesting, however, and this is like the contrast with the Timaeus. So in the Timaeus, each person belongs to some body, and that's to some heavenly body, and that's how the like Proclus will interpret it. So you're either a Martial soul, or a Venus soul, or a Jupiter soul. Here in Plotinus's text, you go back to the heavenly body that you deserve. So if you are very virtuous, you go to the stars. If you're a little less, you go to Saturn, and so on. Right. So it's not just about going
Hmm.
back to where you came from.
So
Um,
the idea of the spheres is something like the spheres or the stars have this like perfect movement, and down here everything is wandering around, so it's confused, and it would be better to be a star.
yeah, it would be better to be a star. And so if you've lived already a very good life, it's like you've already lived a star-like life. And so in your next life, you'll be living in the stars. Right.
Hmm. Okay.
So he goes
But
on.
there's just like the small problem that they don't have oxygen there and stuff. No, no.
Well, you're not then reborn with a human body. You're reborn probably with some kind of astral body and so on.
Oh,
Right?
so those are all
You're
the asteroids and stuff traveling around.
exactly, or the moons of the body, of the planets, or or as I said, aliens. We don't see them, but there are these little points of light spinning around each of the planets, and these are the souls there.
Hmm. But not aliens like with bodies, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, if so, not aliens with bodies, certainly they belong to these planets not by something gross like gravity pulling them down and walking on them. Gravity belongs to down here. If they're always close to these planets, it's because they're like little stars, much smaller stars that are always following these planets.
Hmm. Right,
Yeah.
somehow.
And we
Okay.
don't see them because they're so close. Yeah.
Right. The aliens is like some kind of projection of their over there. But the
But
whole point is not to
he
be a
he
person.
continues now to discuss how this is possible.
Yeah. Okay. Do you hear me? Because you got stuck a little. Um. Oops. Mm. Hello? Oops.
Hi, sorry, I think
Yeah.
my internet fell.
Oh, okay.
Um, yeah, I think it's yeah, like the aliens didn't like me calling their bodies gross. But
Okay. That's all.
let me let me return to the slideshow. So after having stated this, that some souls go to the heavens and others go outside of the world, and like they become pure nous, I guess. He starts to explain how this is possible.
Hmm. Um, okay. Now, we must understand, while our souls do contain an intellectual cosmos, they also contain a subordination of various forms, like that of the cosmic soul. The world soul, which is the same thing as the cosmic soul, is distributed so as to produce the fixed sphere and the planetary circuits corresponding to its graded powers. So with our soul, they must have their provinces according to their different powers, parallel to those of the world soul. Each must give out its own special act. Released, each will inhabit there a star consonant with a temperament and faculty and act within and constituting the principle of the life. And this star, the next higher power, will stand to them as God, or more exactly as tutelary spirit.
Okay. So he mentioned before this idea that where each soul is an intellectual cosmos, and in this treatise, because there that was like right after he talked about how who will become a daimon and who will become a god. It's the one who lives like that. And so he says, since each soul in principle can become everything in the cosmos, then it has to have in itself all the forms of everything and has to have this intellectual cosmos within it. And now he says, now he spells out, not only do we have this intellectual cosmos, but rather we have in ourselves also a structure like the cosmos. So this is partially from the Timaeus, right? So we have the circle of the same, which corresponds to what gives life to the fixed stars, and we have the circle of the other in ourselves, which corresponds to the spheres of the seven planets. And, and so, since we have the powers of all those planets, we can then also live according to any of these things. And what's important is that this all belongs to the rational soul in in the Timaeus, right? And so this is why we have these many different possibilities um, of becoming a sage, right? There are many different kinds of virtuous sagely life, corresponding to each of the powers of the world soul that gives life to the stars. Um, and here he's like being a bit ambiguous between, is it the powers of the world soul that give life to the stars, or is it like specific souls of each star that correspond to these powers? He doesn't really care about that, it seems.
Mhm.
Um, and then he says, so since we have all these powers within us, we can live, a Jupiter life or a Saturn life or a Sun life. And furthermore, then when we're reborn as, in the vicinity of that life, or, after we die, we go up to that sphere. Then we take that star as our daimon, right? So again, just as like before, he wanted to emphasize even when you become an animal, you still have a daimon. Here he's saying even when you go up to the stars, you still have a daimon. It's whatever star you're accompanying, right?
Mhm.
Um, okay,
Okay.
and right.
So
Then
I'm a star because you were already a star, or somehow, because the soul was
uh,
made out of stars, or the same kind of thing.
uh, repeat again.
So
Sorry, I
this
didn't.
whole thing is that you can become a star because the stars are also um, led by a soul or something like that. Or your soul is the same kind of thing than the stars. There's just all these different kind of stars because there's different parts and so on.
Right, your soul is the same kind of thing as the world soul, and so like this is also what contrasts with later, again with Proclus, with later philosophers. So Proclus will say you have a Martian soul, and so you can only go back to Mars. Um, Stein is saying no, you have a cosmic soul, you have a soul that's like the soul of the whole world, so you can go anywhere, right?
Okay.
And yeah.
Depending on what kind.
Um, yeah. So here there's like much more variety as to what kinds of life a person can lead and what kind of lives a person can lead well. So Proclus thinks, for instance, that you can, of course, if you're a Martian soul, you can lead the life of anyone who, of any kind of soul. You can lead a Saturn life, and you can lead a life like that of the fixed stars. But you will only return to the heavens, and you will only have a good life if you choose a Martian life again. So this is much more open in some sense. Um, uh, let me
Huh? But here,
here, but here, yeah,
some further
all the way to
yeah.
originals are, yeah.
Emancipated souls, for the whole period of their sojourn here above, have transcended this spirit nature and the entire fatality of birth. Yeah, that's birth is a kind of fatality, and all that belongs to this visible world. For they have been taken up with them that hypostasis of the soul in which the desire of earthly life is vested. This hypostasis may be described as the distributable soul, for it is what enters bodily forms and multiplies itself by this division among them. But its distribution is not arithmetical, not a matter of magnitudes. Wherever it is present, there is the same thing present, entire. Its unity can always be reconstructed. When living things, animal or vegetal, distribute themselves and produce their constant succession of new forms, they do so in virtue of the self-distribution of this phase of the soul. For it must be as much distributed among the new forms as the propagating originals are.
First, we'll go so far. So here he wants to explain a bit more about maybe what he just said about the both the souls that leave the cosmos and those that somehow stay in the cosmos, but they associate with a certain part of the heavens. So he says that those that leave the cosmos, they are entirely they no longer have a daimon, right? Because they have become identified with nous itself, right? Or something like that. And and so they have transcended the spirit nature and the entire vitality of birth and everything that takes down here. And why can they do this? They can do this because they have, as it were, retracted the distributable soul. What is this distributable soul? This is the an expression from the Timaeus, that which is distributed about bodies. And it's an expression used in the context of the creation of the world soul. But Plotinus is interpreting it here as it were, that illumination or that power that is derived from the soul that always remains above and stays down here, right? It's not Heracles, it's the shadow of Heracles down here, right? And so he's saying that the how can you leave this? How is it possible to just leave this world? Well, you're actually in this world, not yourself, but this image or shadow of you, this activity of yours giving life to a specific body. And that is what is your presence down here. But, this presence can just leave, right? And so it's partially what he's explaining is that you leave the world not by, as it were, going to the edge of the world and then stepping out, but rather you just pull back your attention, you pull back your activity from any body. And so um, if your focus is no longer on any kind of bodily life, then also you will leave the world. Um, and he then adds some things about specifying this is uh stuff that's important to his theory of soul about how this image of the soul makes itself present in every part of the body as a whole, right? So the whole is as a whole in your brain, and it's also as a whole in your pinky, right? He has arguments for this in his treatise, for instance, on the immortality of soul. But he's just bringing it in here in order to explain because the distinction between this presence of the soul and the actual thing, right? Because if you thought that the soul was present in the body, like distributed in the body by having different parts, so like you only have say maybe some sensitive and some locomotive soul in your pinky, and you have your rational soul in your brain, then you might think, well, it's not like you can as if you could pull this all back into the rational soul. And he's saying, no, it's the whole soul that's present in every part. And so it always, even now, it has some a little distinction from the different parts of the body, and so that's why it can retract itself. And and then he also gives the example about how from one living being you can make many. One way of construing this is how McKenna has. McKenna seems to think that he's talking um, about reproduction, right? So like one animal generates other animals, and of course all the animals or all the plants are given life by transcendent souls that exist in themselves. But then like the way McKenna does it, it seems weird. It seems to be that you are that in some sense it's one soul that's giving life to all this succession of new animals and vegetables. And I'm not sure that's actually, I think the time sticks to one soul, one body, so I don't think that's really what he has in mind here. Although he could, I mean, there's no reason for Plotinus's theory of soul about why, especially in like lower things where, they're not, especially in plants, for instance, and maybe also some very simple kinds of animals where you won't say they have an individual movement, motion of their own. They're just doing what their species does, no matter always in that situation. Plotinus could have one soul for many bodies. That wouldn't be too much of a problem for him. But you could also read this passage, read the Greek by thinking that from a single living being, many come. So from a single soul, it gives rise, it gives life to a whole body, which has many parts that are alive. Or also the same thing with a vegetable, with a plant. Or also it could the idea again could be that the single living being being the single plant being the animal or plant in the soul, so like the intelligible form, and the soul then gives life successively to different plants or animals. Um, it's a bit hard to see how to parse this, but anyway, this is the distribution he's talking about
Mm.
the soul being present in the body merely through an image, right? And so yeah,
It's
well,
just here to
what's
explain something.
yeah. So here what's close to the soul is alive, what's far away is dead. Um, yeah. But then he goes on. In some cases,
In some cases, it communicates its force by permanent presence, the life prince, by permanent presence, the life principle in plants, for instance. In other cases, it withdraws after imparting its virtue. For instance, where from the perpetuity of dead animals or vegetable matter, a multitudinous birth is produced from one organism. This shows what? I don't know. A power corresponding
right,
to,
and
yeah, is a lot of like
it-
worms and stuff coming out of dead animals.
right. So then he connects this by saying a power corresponding to this and be all must reach down, cooperate in the life of our world. In fact, the very same power. So, what does this mean? So sometimes he says, um, let's first focus. So sometimes the soul is just in the thing. For instance, a living being like an oak or a an animal, he is just alive, and we say there's a soul in there. There's an image of soul acting in there. And in other cases, the soul withdraws, right? In other cases, it gives life to something dead. Maybe he first talked about the plant and then talked about the dead animal or vegetable matter because because trees can live like hundreds of years, and so that's why it's a better example of something permanent. And so in other cases, it withdraws after imparting its virtue, for instance, where from the putridity of dead animal or vegetable matter, a multitudinous birth is produced from more than one organism. I take this to mean that the it's not that somehow a dead body still has soul in it, and therefore it gives life to new animals that would then be without soul. No, maybe it's something like um when the thing dies, the soul is no longer active there. Since the dead thing is organic matter, it's now useful for other animals to come to be, right? He is thinking about cases of spontaneous generation, right? So that spontaneous generation was abandoned very recently in the history of humanity as an explanation for where rats and beetles and things come from. But and then he adds, power corresponding to this in the all must reach down, cooperate in the life of our world. In fact, they're the very same power. So remember, he started this by saying, but here some further precision is required. So he wants to explain this. I mean, he wants to explain this here. He wants to explain how souls leave, but also he wants to explain how there is life in the whole world, because the world soul has all these powers and it gives life to these things. So here he says, so in some cases, the soul is just there and it's permanently there. And so that must correspond to the heavens, right? So he's saying, just the same way that we give life to our bodies by being permanently in our bodies or active in our bodies in some level, the heavens are permanently alive uh, because the world soul is permanently there. And then he says, but there's also the case of where, after we die, the soul leaves this body, but then it's still useful matter, it's still useful organic matter for other souls to come and, give birth to new animals. This must correspond to the sublunar world. The sublunar world is things down here are constantly being alive, getting life. Then these souls are leaving, and new things are being born. So this are being born from that. So this sublunar world is, as it were, this constantly putrefying corpse but it's a fertile corpse where new forms of life are constantly being born. Um, how does this help us? It helps us, first of all, by seeing if this is a if I'm reading this correctly, then he's explaining all life in the world as an activity of even our own life as an activity of the world soul, right? A power corresponding to this in the all must reach down cooperative life of our world. In fact, the very same power. So so that means like just as we have an image down here, the world soul also has an image down here. Well, it's more than that. Um, Even us giving life to our bodies, that's also part of what the world soul does. So previously, there was a question here, is do the planets have souls of their own, or is it just the world soul giving power to them? Well, since here he's explaining what we do with our bodies in terms of the world soul's action, then presumably, just as we have souls of our own, also the planets have souls of their own. So that's something that we learn from this, besides this colorful view um, of the sublunar world as a rotting body. Um, and also introducing, of course, this idea of the image or the projection or the illumination of the soul in the body explains also how soul can leave the body, right, in the first place, and can leave the whole perceptible world.
And is it something like
Um,
because there's all these kinds of life somehow coming out of the one original life?
mhm.
Okay.
Right. I mean, it can also explain, right, because this might be a question about, like, you might raise a question here about, wait, didn't he argue previously that the world soul doesn't pay attention at all to its body? And therefore, it doesn't have this second thing. So maybe the idea here is, look, there is this illumination from the world soul, and that's what we're imitating when we go back to the or when we go to the stars and so on, and we live stellar lives. And
Hmm.
what we're imitating when we leave the world entirely, well, we're imitating this true life of the world, which is entirely focused on the forms.
Hmm.
Um, so in that sense, in any case, we're imitating the world soul.
Okay.
Um, okay, so that then will close this
Yeah.
thing about what happens when the soul goes up, right? Soul goes down, has a bad daimon. If it goes up, well, then either it goes to a star, and then the star is the daimon, or it leaves this perceptible world entirely, right? And it has
Hmm.
no daimon, like. And then he talks about this whole coming down, it seems again. Maybe since he talked about the possibility of it going out, he talks about it going down again. So it's kind of
Okay. If this soul returns to the sphere, it finds itself under the same spirit or anew, according to the life it lives, life that is to live. With this spirit embarks in the skiff of the universe, the spindle of necessity, then takes control and appoints the seat for the voyage, the seat of the lot in life.
right. So here it's interesting that he's talking about returning to this sphere. Um, so after it's left this world, it then goes back and then comes back, and it can uh as it were, choose the same daimon and life again, or maybe it chooses a different one. There's problems about how to understand this because if you leave this world, you live time. And so, like, what do you mean what would it mean to say that the soul spends 10,000 years outside this world? It just, there's no time for it. Maybe just for us. But um, and I think this kind of thing is why later Platonists will no longer talk about the souls leaving the cosmos. Um, but Plotinus doesn't seem like so careful about his cosmology here, because his
Mhm.
interest is mainly metaphysical and ethical. Um, and so in coming down, he uses this image of the skiff of the universe. So this is complicated about this passage because he first uses this image of the skiff of the universe, so the whole world is a boat, and right after he's going to talk about the soul being in its own boat. So what is how do we understand this? So in one sense, the whole world is a boat. What does that mean? So if it's a boat, then this is the image from the statesman, perhaps. In the boat, in that it's the world is a boat on the sea of unlikeness, right? And we saw this talk about unlikeness as something you can fall into in the treatise on virtue. And there, it's this idea about that the world it's like it learns from the demiurge the forms. But as things reproduce, one thing imitates another, is an imitation, is of an imitation, is an imitation, then the universal properties of things can be lost, and it could fall into the sea of unlikeness in the sense that the whole world could just become particulars without there being any universal laws or something like that. Like that's just like the absurd terrible nightmare scenario that's described in The Statesman. Um, and so here but if we understand, like, okay, what is this world as ship supposed to do? So that means it's sailing on this sea of unlikeness, and it's guided by the forms, right? So, it sees the forms as it were on the horizon, and that's what guides this ship, and it doesn't want to capsize or fall into the sea. We can think of it as it were to think of it in a different way is to think of, the world, it reflects the forms perfectly, right? Has it's a cosmic eye. And so the world soul is constantly thinking one soul, one form after another. And you could think of it, and so one image of this is that the whole world is a ship and it's visiting one form after another. And so, like, it could be this is the age of justice, this is the age of beauty, this is the age of that. In this, he mentions the spindle of necessity, right? That takes control. So the spindle of necessity is an image for the planets in in the myth of Ur that each on the top of each of the planets there's a siren and the spindle, right? So this weaving mechanism is used by the fates to spin out the fate, or like the model of life that each soul takes, right? And um and so here, you could think that, so what is again this the soul picking a certain life? It's entering, and um what is also the world as a boat amongst on the sea of unlikeness amongst the forms. So here it's as it were the and in the and the spindle is both a weaving mechanism in the myth of Ur, but it's also compared to the mast of a boat, mast of a trireme. So it could be that the idea is that this thing of that the world soul knows one form after another, that's actually manifested in the motion of the planets, that they're thinking different forms, or like the thought of a form is a complex thing that it's expressed in these complex motions of the planets. And then the soul, when it picks its life, it will say pick a certain constellation, a certain disposition of the planets when it's born, and then this is then how the spindle of necessity takes control and appoints the seat of its voyage, right? Where it's sitting in the ship of the world, right? So what this tells us basically is that the choice of life and the choice of daimon is connected somehow with a certain stellar constellation, and the stellar constellation is uh, an expression or a mirror of the cognitive life of the world soul, something like that. And And then he continues.
I'm gonna finish. Okay. The universal circuit is like a breeze, and the voyager, still or stirring, is carried forward by it. He has 100 varied experiences, fresh sights, changing circumstances, all sorts of events. The vessel itself furnishes incident, tossing as it drives on, and the voyager also acts of himself in virtue of that individuality in which he retains, because he is on the vessel in his own person and character. Under identical circumstances, individuals answer very differently in their movements and desires and acts. Hence, it comes about that be the occurrences and the conditions of life similar or dissimilar, the result may differ from man to man. As, on the other hand, the similar result may be reduced by dissimilar conditions. This, for circumstances, that constitutes destiny, or fate, I guess.
Yeah, hey Marmini. And let me check here. This, yeah, hey Marmini. So here he then, as I warned you, he switches the metaphor because now you yourself are in your own vessel. You're in your own boat. And but anyway, the point is that you're on this boat and you see tons of different things happening, and uh, and that is um and that represents the fact that, okay, no matter what life you choose, you're going to then be that this involves lots of contingent accidents. And so, like in the myth of the um the lives picked aren't just like ethical characters, like a tyrant or hero. It's like a tyrant of a rich city or a hero who loses everything. Someone who marries and this happens to them. So there are also accidents and things. But so he's emphasizing that with the choice of daimon, there's also a choice of circumstance, and but freedom always exists. So even though you're in these conditions, neither the choice of daimon nor the conditions can actually determine whether you'll lead a virtuous or a vicious life. And with that, he closes it, um, the text.
Mhm.
Um, okay, so uh, oh, we
Fair.
went a bit before, a bit
Yeah.
beyond. Okay. But yeah, so that was it, and we'll continue with Porphyry next week. Okay, but that wraps up Plotinus on virtue, on virtue and on the daimon.
Mhm.
So I'll do a recap next time about exactly what we learned from the daimon treatise and how it connects to the virtue. But we'll already start on Porphyry.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Well, have a nice week then. Oh yeah, and next week is normal.
I think so, yeah. Should be fine.
Okay. Great. Okay.
Okay.
Have a good one.